Once you understand Tawhid, reality stops looking random and starts revealing a hidden order. Ibn Arabi warned that misunderstanding divine oneness creates spiritual blindness, not wisdom. Stay, and you will learn the single question that exposes whether you truly see God's reality or merely imagine it inside your own heart. The first mistake most people make about Tawhid is believing it means only one thing, that there is one God. That is true, but Ibn Arabi insisted that this is only the beginning. If Tawhid remains an idea you agree with, rather than a reality you see, then you still live inside fragmentation. And fragmentation changes everything about how you pray, how you suffer, how you love, and how you understand yourself. Tawhid means that God is one. But Ibn Arabi asks a harder question. If God is truly one, then what does that mean about everything else? Most people live as though existence contains many independent powers. They fear people. They fear money. They fear the future. They fear loss. They say they believe in God. But emotionally, they live in a crowded universe filled with competing forces. Ibn Arabi says this inner division is the real veil. He does not begin with philosophy. He begins with attention. He asks you to look carefully at your own heart. What do you trust when you are afraid? What do you worship when you suffer? What do you believe can save you when everything collapses? That is your real Tawhid. This is why the great Sufi masters never treated Tawhid as an abstract belief. They treated it as a diagnosis of perception. They wanted to know whether you saw one source behind all things, or whether you secretly believed that power belonged to many things. A person who has not realized Tawhid feels pulled apart every day. Their prayer says one thing. Their fears say another. Their tongue declares that God controls everything, while their heart acts as if created things possess independent power. The trap here is subtle. You can memorize every theological proof of divine oneness and still live as a practical polytheist. Not because you worship idols made of stone, but because you give ultimate power to reputation, wealth, status, fear, desire, and your own ego. Ibn Arabi warned that the greatest idol is often the self that believes it has no idols. The exit begins with one act of honesty. You stop asking whether you believe in God. You begin asking whether you believe anything else possesses independent power alongside him. That question changes everything. Al-Wujud, true existence, Ibn Arabi's most famous teaching, begins with a statement so simple that many people miss its danger. God alone possesses true existence. He did not mean that the world is fake. He did not mean that you are God. He did not mean that mountains, trees, and human beings are illusions. He spent his life defending the difference between the Creator and creation. What he meant was something much stranger. When you stand before a mirror, you see a reflection. The reflection is real. You can point to it. You can describe it. But the reflection possesses nothing of itself. Its entire reality depends on something beyond it. For Ibn Arabi, creation resembles this mirror. You exist. Your choices matter. Your suffering matters. Your worship matters. But none of these possess independent existence. Every breath arrives from God. Every moment remains through God. Every moment returns to God. This realization changes the experience of daily life. When something beautiful happens, you stop worshiping the gift and begin recognizing the giver. When something painful happens, you stop imagining that reality has escaped divine wisdom. When you succeed, pride weakens. When you fail, despair weakens. The world remains real, but it stops pretending to be ultimate. The trap here is even more dangerous than the first. Some people hear this teaching and become passive. They stop acting, they stop struggling. They say, if God is behind everything, then nothing matters. Ibn Arabi rejected this completely. The person who truly understands dependence does not become weaker. They become freer. They act with greater courage because they no longer believe created things possess the final word. And this leads to the question that terrified many students of Ibn Arabi. If only God possesses true existence, why do you still feel so separate from him? If you'd like, I can continue with the same theological safeguards, pacing, and emotional intensity in part 2. Huwa la huwa he, and not he this, is the sentence that made Ibn Arabi famous, feared, and misunderstood. He called creation huwa la huwa he, and not he. At first this sounds impossible. How can something be both? How can the world reveal God and yet not be God? Ibn Arabi believed this confusion happens because the human mind wants simple answers to realities that are not simple. When you look at sunlight reflected on water, you truly see the sun. Yet you do not believe the sun lives inside the river. The reflection reveals the sun without becoming the sun. This is how Ibn Arabi understood existence. Every act of mercy reveals God's name, Ar-Rahman, the most merciful. Every act of justice reveals God's name, Al-Adl, the just. Every act of beauty reveals God's name, Al-Jamil, the beautiful. But the created thing itself never becomes God. This changes how you experience reality. You stop seeing the world as a collection of objects. You begin seeing it as signs. Every encounter becomes a question. Every event becomes a mirror. Every joy and every wound asks the same thing. What divine attribute is revealing itself here? The person who lives in this awareness does not escape reality. They enter reality more deeply than before. But there is a trap. The ego loves this teaching because it wants to erase the distance between itself and God. It wants to hear, everything is God, because then it can secretly conclude, I am God. Ibn Arabi considered this a disaster. He insisted on both halves of the formula, he and not he, presence and transcendence, nearness and absolute otherness. The moment you remove one side, you stop seeing reality and begin worshiping your own imagination. The exit requires humility. You must accept that reality is greater than your ability to explain it. The paradox is not a mistake. The paradox protects Tawhid itself. Tajalli, divine self-disclosure. If God remains absolutely beyond creation, then how do human beings know him? Ibn Arabi's answer is Tajalli, divine self-disclosure. God reveals himself through his signs, his names, and his actions, not because he needs to be known, but because knowing him is the purpose of creation itself. This means every moment contains revelation, not revelation in the prophetic sense. Revelation ended with Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. Ibn Arabi never compromised this. Rather, he taught that every created thing continuously reveals something about its creator. The sunrise reveals generosity. Death reveals power. Forgiveness reveals mercy. Justice reveals wisdom. Silence reveals majesty. You experience Tajalli every day. The problem is not that God hides himself. The problem is that the human heart becomes distracted. Think about your own life. How many times did suffering feel meaningless until years later? How many times did loss become the door to understand? How many times did something painful reveal a wisdom you could not see before? For Ibn Arabi, this is not coincidence. Reality speaks constantly. The trap is demanding that God reveal himself according to your expectations. Many people decide in advance how divine wisdom should look. When life refuses to obey those expectations, They conclude that God has abandoned them. But Ibn Arabi says the opposite. The very event you resist may be the exact place where God is revealing himself most clearly. The exit begins with surrender, not surrender of intelligence, not surrender of responsibility, surrender of the illusion that you already know how God should act. Al-Qalb, the heart, as the organ of knowledge. Modern people trust the mind above everything else. Ibn Arabi did not reject reason. He used it constantly. But he believed reason alone could never reach the deepest truths. The heart, Al-Qalb, is not merely a place of emotion. It is a faculty of perception. Just as the eye perceives color and the ear perceives sound, the purified heart perceives divine meaning. This explains a strange fact about spiritual life. Two people can witness the exact same event and experience completely different realities. One person sees an accident and sees only chaos. Another person sees fragility, dependence, mortality, and the need for mercy. One person sees prayer as ritual. Another experiences prayer as a meeting. One person reads the Quran and sees words. Another encounters a living address. The difference is not intelligence. The difference is the condition of the heart. This is why Al-Ghazali and Ibn Arabi agreed on something essential. The greatest barrier to knowledge is not ignorance. It is impurity. Pride clouds perception. Envy clouds perception. Greed clouds perception. Self-importance clouds perception. The person trapped here believes they need more information. They read more books. They memorize more concepts. They collect spiritual language. But the heart remains unchanged. And an unchanged heart cannot see a changed reality. The exit is painful because it requires losing something. You lose the belief that spiritual understanding comes primarily through collecting ideas. Instead, you begin polishing the heart itself. Because the most frightening possibility Ibn Arabi presents is not that God is absent. It is that God may be revealing himself constantly, while your own heart remains unable to see him. And if that is true, then one final question remains. How can you tell whether your worship brings you closer to God or merely closer to yourself? Ubudiyya, servanthood, as the highest station. This is where Ibn Arabi overturns almost every modern spiritual fantasy. Most people imagine that the spiritual path ends with power, knowledge, or extraordinary experiences. Ibn Arabi says it ends with servanthood, not ordinary servanthood. Perfect servanthood. The closer a person comes to God, the less they claim for themselves. The more they know, the less they boast. The more they experience, the less they identify with their own experiences. This is why Ibn Arabi repeatedly described the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, using the title God himself chose during the night journey, his servant. Not prophet, not messenger, not saint, servant, because servanthood contains every other perfection. What does this feel like from the inside? It feels like relief. You stop carrying the burden of being your own God. You stop believing that your intelligence controls outcomes. You stop demanding that reality obey your desires. You still act. You still struggle. You still plan. But you no longer worship your own plans. The person who reaches this station becomes strangely fearless. They are not fearless because they believe they control reality. They are fearless because they know they never controlled it. This is the aspiration figure Ibn Arabi presents. A person whose prayer is sincere even when nobody sees it. A person whose gratitude survives loss. A person who accepts praise without pride and criticism without collapse. A person who walks through the world with immense humility because they see God everywhere and themselves nowhere. The trap here is devastating. The ego can turn even humility into pride. It whispers, "Look how humble you have become. Look how spiritual you are. Look how much deeper you see than everyone else." This is why the greatest saints feared themselves more than they feared the world. The exit is constant vigilance. You never stop asking, am I seeking God, or am I seeking a spiritual version of myself? Muhasaba al-Qalb, watching the heart. This brings us to the question that haunted Ibn Arabi throughout his life. How do you know whether your worship has been accepted? Not with certainty. Only God knows that. But how do you recognize the signs? His answer is both simple and terrifying. Watch your heart after worship. Most people examine the worship itself. Was my prayer correct? Did I pronounce the words properly? Did I complete the actions? Ibn Arabi says the deeper question comes afterward. What happened to your heart? If prayer produces humility, gratitude, patience, mercy, and dependence upon God, then the prayer carried light. If prayer produces pride, self-satisfaction, harshness, superiority, or attachment to your own performance, then something else entered that worship. The accepted prayer changes the person praying. The accepted fast changes the person fasting. The accepted remembrance changes the person remembering. The act itself matters, but its fruit matters too. Imagine two people leaving the mosque. One leaves believing he has become better than others. The second leaves feeling more aware of his own weakness and more dependent on God's mercy. Who understood worship? For Ibn Arabi, the answer is obvious. The first worshipped his own spiritual image. The second worshipped God. This is why watching the heart takes only seconds. You do not need visions. You do not need mystical experiences. You need honesty. Ask yourself after worship, do I feel softer or harder? More grateful or more entitled? More humble or more important? More dependent on God or more impressed with myself? Your heart already knows the answer. The trap is refusing to look. Because once you see the truth, you become responsible for it. Tawhid al-Shuhud, the unity of witnessing eventually. If a person continues this path, something begins to change. Not outside. Inside, they stop seeing separate events everywhere. They begin seeing one reality expressing itself through countless forms. Their suffering no longer feels random. Their blessings no longer feel deserved. Their worship no longer feels like a transaction. Their life no longer feels abandoned. This does not mean they become God. It does not mean they see God's essence. Ibn Arabi repeatedly rejected these ideas. It means they begin witnessing Tawhid directly. They see that every fear points toward dependence on God. Every beauty points toward God's beauty. Every loss points toward God's permanence. Every love points toward God's love. The universe becomes transparent. Not because the world disappears, because the illusion of independence disappears. This is why Ibn Arabi insisted that true knowledge does not make a person less human. It makes them more human, more patient, more merciful, more honest, more grateful, more aware of their own poverty before God. And here is the final trap. Many people want the experience of witnessing without the discipline of servanthood. They want illumination without obedience. They want closeness without surrender. They want spiritual insight without spiritual death. Ibn Arabi says this never works. The door to divine knowledge opens inward. And the key is not brilliance. It is humility. But if all of this is true, then what does a human being actually look like after Tawhid stops being a belief and becomes the structure of their entire existence? There is a reason Ibn Arabi's students described meeting certain saints as more convincing than reading entire libraries. Because some people become evidence, not evidence of themselves. Evidence of Tawhid. The person who has truly understood divine oneness does not look extraordinary in the way most people imagine. They do not constantly speak about mystical experiences. They do not announce their spiritual rank. They do not walk through life trying to appear enlightened. They become difficult to shake. Their peace does not disappear when money disappears. Their dignity does not disappear when status disappears. Their gratitude does not disappear when comfort disappears, because they stopped attaching themselves to things that disappear. This person still feels pain. They still grieve. They still fear. But underneath every emotion sits a deeper certainty. God remains. When people praise them, they thank God. When people insult them, they examine themselves. When success comes, they become more grateful. When failure comes, they become more sincere. They do not see themselves as the center of reality. They see themselves as servants within reality. This is the human being Tawhid creates. And once you meet such a person, even briefly, you begin to understand why Ibn Arabi believed that the highest proof of spiritual truth was not argument, it was transformation. The frightening part is that you already know where you stand. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough to begin. Ask yourself honestly, do I fear losing people more than I fear losing God? When something good happens, do I thank God first or myself first? When something painful happens, do I believe wisdom still exists? Do I worship because I love God or because I love feeling spiritual? When I succeed, do I become more humble or more important? When I fail, do I turn toward God or away from Him? Do I spend more time protecting my image or purifying my heart? When I say there is no power except through God, do I actually live as if that is true? None of these questions require scholarship. They require courage. Because the heart usually knows where it stands long before the mind admits it. And there is one final diagnostic Ibn Arabi returns to again and again. What happens when God does not give you what you wanted? This question reveals almost everything. If disappointment destroys your faith, then perhaps your faith was attached to outcomes. If suffering destroys your gratitude, then perhaps your gratitude was attached to comfort. If delay destroys your trust, then perhaps your trust was attached to control. The people closest to God are not those who receive everything they ask for. They are those who remain servants when they receive nothing they expected. This is the hidden measure of Tawhid. Not what you say when life obeys you, what you become when it does not. But this raises the most practical question of all. If your heart is divided, if your trust is fragmented, if your Tawhid exists more in theory than in reality, where do you begin? Because Ibn Arabi's answer is far simpler and far more demanding than most people expect. Ibn Arabi's answer begins with a refusal. He refuses to give you a secret formula. He refuses to offer a mystical shortcut. He refuses to promise an experience that will suddenly transform your life. Because the foundation of Tawhid is not extraordinary experience. It is truthful seeing. The first practice begins tonight. After your next prayer, do nothing for 30 seconds. Do not reach for your phone. Do not stand up immediately. Do not congratulate yourself for praying. Instead, watch your heart. Ask one question. Do I feel closer to God or closer to the image of myself that just prayed? Do not answer quickly. Wait, because the first response often comes from pride. The second response often comes from truth. The second practice begins this week. Choose one thing you fear losing. Not everything, just one thing. Your reputation, your money, someone's approval, your plans, your health. Then ask yourself a difficult question. If God took this from me, would I still believe he is wise? This question is not punishment. It is diagnosis. Because Ibn Arabi believed that your deepest fear often reveals your deepest attachment, and your deepest attachment often reveals where your Tawhid remains incomplete. Do not judge yourself. Just look. Truthful seeing is already a form of healing. The third practice may be the hardest. Throughout the day, whenever something happens, good or bad, pause for one moment and ask, what divine attribute might be revealing itself here? When you receive kindness, look for mercy. When you experience difficulty, look for wisdom. When you witness beauty, look for generosity. When you face your own weakness, look for your dependence on God. This practice changes the world slowly, not because the world changes, because you change. And when perception changes, reality itself begins to feel different. Perhaps this is why Tawhid is not merely the first teaching of Islam. It is the last teaching too. You begin by saying there is no God but God. If God grants you success, you end by discovering that there never was any power, beauty, wisdom, mercy, or permanence except through him. Everything else was always passing. Everything else was always borrowed. Everything else was always pointing beyond itself. This does not make the world smaller. It makes the world sacred. It means that every person you meet carries dignity because they were created by God. It means that every blessing deserves gratitude because it came from God. It means that every suffering deserves patience because it unfolds under God's wisdom. And it means that your own life, with all its failures, fears, hopes, and unanswered questions, has never existed outside his knowledge for even a single moment. This is why Ibn Arabi never treated Tawhid as a theory. He treated it as liberation. Liberation from fear, liberation from pride, liberation from despair, liberation from the exhausting burden of pretending that you were ever the center of reality. Because the greatest secret hidden inside Tawhid is not that God is one. It is that once you truly know this, you no longer have to carry the world by yourself. You never did. Now answer honestly. What is the one thing in your life that you fear losing so much that it reveals where your trust still competes with your trust in God?